All right, thank you all for coming. This is the third annual Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies JIW Research Forum. My name is Ilyana Kuzhemko, along with Steve Redding. We're the co-directors of the Griswold Center. I'm also in the economics department, the director of the senior thesis program, so I'll be seeing all of you guys next year when you are embarking on your senior thesis. So the purpose of this forum is to showcase for the juniors examples of junior papers. We pick papers that are policy related, which is a large majority of the junior papers. So you can just get a start on thinking about ideas for your own junior paper. These are all very well done junior papers. These are like examples of junior papers that are, at the top of the curve, so to speak. I also, we want this to be a forum that sparks ideas. We don't want you to think that every junior paper has to sort of have this particular form. These are just 6 examples that stood out to us as we read through them. There are many other examples of junior papers that are on the website. So think of this as a way of sparking ideas, and don't think of this as limiting, where something sort of has to follow the form that you see the papers today. So before getting started with the talks, I want to say a few thank yous. Thank you to Kelly Noonan, who's the director of the junior paper program at Princeton, Sylvia Weyerbrook and Smita Bronemeyer for their collaboration in developing this new program, which is now in its 3rd year that we did the talk event with you guys. So I'm going to introduce the students presenting and briefly just give a 1 or 2 sentence line about their paper. We're going to hold the questions until the end. So there's going to be talks all in a row, and then you'll have a chance to do Q&A. And we hope to, wrap things up not too more than an hour and 15 or so. Okay, our first speaker for today is Khadijah Anwar, whose advisor was Swati Bhatt. This paper looks at the barriers to women's accessibility of growing telecom access. Andrew Castleman will be the speaker after that. Andrew's advisor was Ernest Liu. And Andrew's research looks at the entrance of Uber into US cities and looks at the effects on wages as a result of Uber's entry into local labor markets. Our third speaker is Leland Domaratzky, whose advisor was Jonathan Payne. And that Leland's research is looking at the effect of a particular legal case, the Halliburton II case, on securities fraud litigation. Our fourth speaker is Caren Jew, who was advised by Orly Ashenfelter. Karen's research looks at reforms that ban the box. I think you might know of these reforms that outlaw any questions about people's past felony or incarceration history when they apply for a job. So our fifth speaker is Sophia Lewandrowski, advised by Professor Silver. This junior paper looks at the effect of caps on attorney contingency fees on state health expenses. So one thought is that if the reason that we have lots of healthcare spending is that doctors are, this looks at a change in the rules around litigation in that area. And the final speaker that we have today is Emiri Morita, again advised by Orly Ashenfelter. And this paper looks at a particular reform called the Power Initiative grants in coal-dependent communities in Appalachia. All right, so without further
Hi, everyone. I'm Khadijah. My advisor was Professor Swati Bhatt, who I'd like to thank for her support and guidance through this whole process. And my paper looked at the barriers to Indian women benefiting from growing telecom subscriptions in the region. Now, at the heart of my research is this paradox, as you may gather from the title, where as telecom subscriptions in the region are growing, women are actually dropping out of the labor force at higher and higher rates. We'd expect surely that with new technologies and access to greater information, women would be able to improve their employment prospects. So this paradox poses a puzzling question, and that's what my research digs into. So let's begin with some background and motivation. Why do we care about this? So historically, technological inventions have made household labor less time-consuming for women and allowed them to get involved in the economy in more diverse ways. So key examples of such inventions include household appliances like food processors, washing machines, and dishwashers, each of which free up women's time so that they can use it in other more productive ways. Today, we're making great strides in the communication technology. And we expect that this progress, especially for women in societies with heavy traditional gender norms, would free up their time and allow them to get involved because now they can remotely stay in touch with their children. They can work from home and they can seek out information that they're otherwise socially inhibited from accessing. So, as I mentioned earlier, telecom subscriptions in the region are growing rapidly. So teledensity, which is the number of cell phones per 100 people, increased from 1.9% to 38% just between 2005 and 2012. However, a very large gender gap persists in India, and as you can see from this figure up here, the male to female ratio is far worse in India than most other countries, with around 3 times more men in the labor force than women. Why do we care? Well, India has some of the highest domestic violence and assault rates in the world, making women's financial independence and autonomy a critical issue. So let's dig deeper into this paradox. So this graph up here says it all. So the solid line is the growth in telecom subscriptions, and female labor force participation, which is the dashed line, is essentially the mirror image of that. It's declining and moving in the complete opposite direction. What this means is that women are actually not benefiting from the growth in from the dissemination of cellular technology in the region, which poses a very interesting research question, because ideally we'd want women to be able to benefit from all the gains that technology dissemination can bring them. All right, so jumping into my hypothesis. So based on everything we just talked about, I hypothesize that the growth in the number of telecom subscribers nationwide is correlated with a decrease in the female labor force participation. Now, why a decrease specifically? Well, there's 5 reasons for that, all of which feed into this idea of the digital divide, which is essentially the idea that men are able to benefit from technology at higher rates than women due to social barriers, essentially getting further ahead and pushing these women out of the labor. So let's dig deeper into the 5 components of that. So the first is poor ICT or computer skills. So women in rural India especially tend to have poor ICT skills than men due to poor education access, meaning that their use of cell phones is limited, mainly texting and calling. The second is curtailed access to mobile features. So women are often given family devices or old phones simply to fulfill household functions like staying in touch with relatives, whereas men tend to have private browsing devices with free internet and free information acquisition. The third is traditional gender roles in the form of the income. So as men benefit from this technology dissemination and see an increase in their household income, women in those households now feel that they no longer need to work since their household income is higher. The fourth is inadequate labor demand, which essentially means that the economy is not ready to absorb women in large numbers. And the fifth is measurement error, which is essentially an issue with how government stats measure female labor force participation. We're going to dig deeper into that towards the end of the presentation. So let's jump into the data and analytics. So I used a panel data set containing 19 Indian regions for the years 2012, 2016, and 2018. My outcome variable was female labor force participation, and this was sourced from Women and Men in India reports, which are released by the Indian Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation periodically. The treatment variable was the number of telecom subscriptions, which was sourced from a telecom report distributed by the Department of Telecommunications in India. I included control variables for literacy rates and proxies for sociocultural attitudes, also sourced from these Women and Men in India reports. And I also found data on annual GDP growth sourced from the Economic Statistical Organization of Punjab. So I stated a lot of random government departments at you. The idea here is that you can really take advantage of government data when exploring your junior independent work. So one really important theme to explore was this rural versus urban differences in the data set and results. And the reason for this is that sociocultural inhibitors tend to be a lot more pervasive in rural populations. So it's important to look at how female labor force participation and telecom access are different between rural and urban regions. So as you can see, the figure on the right-hand side here shows that there's a greater difference between like the dash 2018 line and the solid 2012 line in rural regions compared to urban regions, where LFP tends to overlap in both years, suggesting that the decline and adverse effects were much more prominent in rural regions where the lines are visibly further apart. For telecom subscriptions, the solid line shows rural regions, and this is base growth from 2008 in the number of telecom subscribers. And urban regions are in the dashed line, and essentially the growth tapers off after 2011, whereas it continues to grow exponentially in rural regions where connectivity was lower at a base level in 2008. So I'll skim over my methodology. I essentially used a state and time fixed effects model for the primary method, controlling for things that varied over time, were constant across states, and things that varied across states but were constant over time. It included certain control variables, as I mentioned earlier. I repeated this on a total level, and then for rural and urban regions separately. And then I had a supplementary method, which was differences on differences, that essentially just repeated this analysis for the various sub-periods, so 2012 to 16, 2016 to 18, and 2012 to 2018. So, the results. Essentially, what I found was, so I just want to point out that over here, the coefficients that we care about are telecom total at the top, and then tel rural and tel urban for each of those respective models. That's the effect that telecom subscriptions have on female labor force participation, and essentially they don't have any effect at all. They are not a statistically significant predictor of female LFP, neither are the control variables. So there isn't a negative relationship between telecom subscriptions and female LFP, meaning that growing subscriptions are not pushing women out of the labor force by benefiting men more. However, women are not seeing any effects at all of growing telecom penetration, which is still concerning because women are not absorbing the potential gains that increased connectivity and access to digital resources with telecom subscriptions can bring them. Quickly going over the results of this secondary method. These are consistent. We found non-significant results across all of these sub-periods. However, I want to point out that the R-squared here is very low, perhaps due to reducing the sample into such small sub-periods, so it's hard to make reliable deductions. So, one potentially really large barrier to this research is the inaccurate measurement in government reports of female labor force participation, as I touched on earlier. So, the Indian Ministry of Stats and Statistics and Program Implementation uses a combination of face-to-face interviews and paper questionnaires. Self-report methods like this are subject to inaccuracy due to lying or omission by participants. So many women may omit reporting their economic activity in order to avoid taxation or due to familial pressures to report men as the primary breadwinners in their households. Another important consideration here is that many female workers tend to work for only small periods of time in the year, which are easy to underreport or neglect, leading to deflated estimates. So this table here demonstrates that. So the government considered two approaches of considering whether someone was in the labor force, one that requires them to work for at least 6 months roughly of the year, and one for just 30 days. And the difference is way larger for women in both rural and urban regions than men, showing that women tend to be more infrequent and intermittent and inconsistent workers, and so that's easy to underreport, even with this more lenient method. Finally, one other issue was the sectors that women are focused in. So the government is quite good at measuring formal activities such as agriculture, but quite bad at measuring informal sector activity, which includes things like family businesses, domestic and childcare services, and other home businesses. So the results from a Women's Web survey of how women-owned businesses are segmented are shown in this pie chart. And we can see that a lot of activity from women is concentrated in the yellow and light pink sectors, which are other or creative sectors, which are likely informal activity. So maybe women have just migrated over to the informal sector by benefiting from greater connectivity. So they can now run home businesses and sell things over WhatsApp, allowing them to be in this sector. Interestingly, many women in rural regions are actually self-employed, and a 2019 report by Bain and Google showed that the proportion of Indian enterprises that are women-owned increased from 14 to 20% over the past decade, and is projected to increase further, despite falling female LFP. So it might be that we have measurement errors in the self-employed sector, and that women are actually benefiting from this increase in telecom subscriptions, but we just aren't reflecting that in our numbers. So to conclude, so we found that while female labor force participation is on the decline, telecom subscription numbers are probably not driving that due to our non-significant statistics, non-significant coefficients, meaning that while men do tend to benefit more from technologies, they're not directly pushing women out of the economy due to the digital divide. Instead, telecom subscription numbers seem to have no effect at all on female LFP. This suggests that while women are not directly dropping out of the labor force in association with telecom subscription increases, they're not absorbing the economic benefits of increased connectivity either. It is possible that they are, but we're just not able to measure that, as I just touched on in the last two slides. So if we had more granular data on female entrepreneurship activity, we'd be able to better look at this connectivity and employment outcomes relationship. So yeah, well, that concludes my presentation. I'd again like to thank Professor Bhatt and my friends and family who were very big supports during the pandemic. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Castleman. My paper, like was said before, is on the effect of Uber entering different U.S. cities, specifically zooming in on issues of gender and race and looking at potential biases that come out of this macroeconomic effect. And my advisor was Ernest Blue. Definitely many thanks to him for helpful throughout the process. So my paper essentially rests on two very interesting events. One of them is the emergence of the gig economy and companies like Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, Postmates, things that we use all the time. And they really emerged from a really interesting event. Interesting might be not the right word, but the financial crisis, which had three important elements to them. So high unemployment, low average wage, and high debt. And these are all elements that led to a really great environment for something like the gig economy to come out of. So what the gig economy is defined as is short-term contract or freelance work. And so what's interesting about this is that because you're your own boss, you don't fall under certain regulations, and it's really the Wild West in terms of regulations currently in this space. So then I looked at what's happening now. So before COVID, we had a very tight labor market. We had low unemployment, high average wage for gig work, so a very different environment. We also observed, because of this lack of regulation, there is previous literature that it explains a pretty significant wage gap for a study about Uber in California, a study of Amazon workers out in India, that despite the fact that this is all kind of algorithm-based, there's still a pretty significant wage gap between like 6 and 10% in the gig economy. And so I wanted to see if the gig economy is able to impact the broader macroeconomic landscape, as we see in some other literature, does this wage gap persist, or perhaps on a gender basis, as well as a race basis? So this presents two questions. So first, if in this tighter labor market, Uber is perhaps increasing wages within this low-skill segment, how much is Uber really going to influence this wage increase? And then secondly, of this wage increase for low-skilled workers, how is this affecting males versus females, and then white as well as non-white population. So for my data, I really needed just 2 data sets with a variety of variables. So from the American Community Survey, which has millions of different data points, is collected every year, and an extremely interesting data set that I recommend many of you check out, very easy to work with. So I pulled these 6 different elements to look at wages over time based on different locations, based on sex, based on race, and then I'll touch on this job zone variable, which is very important in the next slide. And then secondly, I needed the shock event. So the shock event of my study is when Uber entered a city, which luckily is available through public Uber data. They announced from the years 2011 to 2015 in the cities I was interested in when they entered the city, so I can have a specific date when that occurred. So this is just a summary of my data. I first want to draw out that there's a ton of different data points, but as you kind of cut the data down into different elements, like I have 31 cities that I wanted to study, a large sample size of 1.4 million quickly becomes much smaller as you look at different years, different cities. So very important to start out with a large data set. But to look at this job zone variable, which is very important to my study, there's 5 different zones, each differing by the amount of training that each worker receives. So in zone 1, you have jobs that require maybe days or weeks of training. This is a lot of kind of food prep workers, food servers, taxi drivers, things that you can learn how to do very quickly. They usually don't even require a high school education. Moving all the way up to zones 4 and 5, which might require PhDs, decades of experience, things like that. So I wanted to examine the way that wages worked between these zones to understand if Uber was influencing versus just a general macroeconomic effect. So to look at the first research question, I have these 2 models which have a variety of fixed effects as well, but the first one is really looking at the broader effect. So if Uber enters, what happens to wages? A very simple model, which I didn't expect to really give me a ton of information, but something that was interesting to look at kind of early on. The second one is trying to answer really how big is the effect for low-skill wages versus high-skill wages or anything in between, because the low-skill segment is really where we expect something like Uber to have an impact. And then this really answers the second research question, which is how equitable is the impact of Uber on low-skill wages? So now the interaction term is looking at once Uber enters, what is the disproportionate effect on women? And then when Uber enters, what is the disproportionate effect for people of color? This could perhaps be a negative impact or a positive. So looking at the results, the first model, like I kind of thought, we weren't really going to learn a ton from that. So when Uber enters, first it looks like, oh, Uber's doing great things. It's increasing wages for all. But if you add on the fixed effects, you see that the effect goes down to 1.5%. And not very significant. And this is expected because as Uber enters, they don't really affect a lot of skill zones. And so the effect of just Uber impacting the entire labor market shouldn't really have a strong effect. And in the second model, once again, as you add more fixed effects, the effect is less statistically significant. But if you look at zone 1, in each different model, depending on the fixed effects, zone 1 sees a much more significant effect than zones 2, 3, and 4. If you look back, I don't have zone 5 in this. I removed it because it's a bit of an outlier. There's 1, not very many zone 5 jobs, and 2, they aren't really related to Uber. They're more of Uber's riders than drivers. So I removed that. So here you see it a lot more clearly. I'm looking at it in graphical form. Much more effects in zone 1. And it's also important to look at parallel trends assumption. So using this graph, you can see that kind of before the shock event, with that event kind of shifted to time equals 0, you see pretty similar parallel trends. And then in zone 1, which I want to summarize, or I want to clarify again, is the low skill group compared to the higher skill groups as you go up the chain. You see much more significant effects in terms of wage increases. So now that I knew that zone 1 wages were kind of where I wanted to study, I cut the data to only look at zone 1. So now focusing in on low skilled wages, what happens to the wages of those people, cutting it into different ethnic and gendered groups, what happens to their wages at that shock event. And as you can see in the gender chart, there's a pretty significant effect. If we look at just the female variable, you see what we would simply consider the wage gap that we see today, which I picked up as around 11%. And then below that, you see kind of the disproportionate effect when we look at when Uber enters, what kind of gains are they getting? And it's a pretty significant discount that women are getting versus men, although if you add up all the interaction terms together, you still get a positive impact, at least in the further right model. You see that it's far from fair and far from equal. So that was definitely a very interesting thing to look at. And then the second model is looking at race, and this one you see much less evidence of any kind of bias. You actually see a slight increase in average wages for people in this group, although it's still important to see that kind of as a total, the wage gap, when we just look at the race variable, there's a pretty significant drop in wages just for being part of this group. So although it's not necessarily the focus of the study, we can see some pretty significant and poor wage effects from being in this minority group. So what's interesting about these results is that Uber is definitely in the crux of a legal battle right now, especially if you read the news about California and different states that are following suit and understanding, should we be classifying Uber drivers as full-time employees, and should they be getting the same protections as other full-time employees? So right now, in the gig economy, you aren't protected by Title VII. You aren't really protected by anything. You're your own boss, so why would you kind of get these protections? So Uber is arguing in these courts and in these states, well, if you look at the macro effect of our company, we're increasing wages for people who would be working very low wage, minimum wage jobs are now making $30 an hour as Uber drivers. But if we look at kind of the macroeconomic effect, the people who are getting maybe a small wage boost after kind of what's all said and done in the economy, the non-Uber drivers, the people who are seeing the effects of this tighter labor market, the effects are not equal at all. And this is especially true on the gender scale. So I think that using the argument that the gig economy raises all boats or boosts low-skilled wages for all, not just people in Uber, is something that we need to think about a little deeper. And so as these regulatory arguments persist, it's something that needs to be considered a bit further. That is all.
Hi, everyone. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Leland. My advisors were Jonathan Payne, and my AI was Simon Fox, so thanks to them. My JP was on a specific Supreme Court case handed down in June 2014 called Halliburton 2, and that had to deal with securities fraud class action. So first, what's a securities fraud class action? The canonical example is you invest in a public company. A month later, you find out that the company was lying about its revenue on its 10K, and you, as the shareholder, have the opportunity to sue that company. So securities fraud cases weren't really a thing in the United States until the late 80s, when a case called Basic kind of exploded case volume. And basically what happened is after this case called Basic, a lot of frivolous lawsuits came into play. And there was just this explosion in securities fraud cases. So this was kind of my motivation. So I would see in the news, this happens a lot with pharmaceutical companies. News breaks that a pharmaceutical company's drug has these side effects, and the next day there's all these lawsuits. But the lawsuits aren't from people who are hurt by the side effect or the health concern. They're from the shareholders of the pharmaceutical company saying you didn't disclose the risk of a side effect to your drug in your disclosures. So a lot of quirky things like that happen. A lot of interesting things like a CEO has a heart attack, and the next day you see a lawsuit that the company didn't disclose the health concerns of the CEO. So they're well understood as this kind of plague on the court system, and there's just too much case volume, and it's very easy to file this action and get the company to just settle really quickly. So Congress tried to reform this in 1995 with an act called the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act, but it was kind of watered down. And since then, there hasn't been any changes in how securities fraud cases are litigated, except for a couple of Supreme Court precedents. And every year you see a new precedent formed around securities fraud. So my JP studied a specific precedent called Halliburton 2 in 2014. So what did Halliburton 2 do? In theory, it gave defendants a better chance to get the case dismissed. I'm kind of dismissing the legal procedural issues, but basically what you have to know is the first time that the Supreme Court endorsed quantitative event studies as evidence of no price impact. So if you take in 362, you know what an event study is. The Supreme Court said that you can introduce an expert, and experts cost a lot of money, to say that whatever fraudulent activity the company was involved in didn't actually have a material impact on the stock price. So that's what Halliburton 2 did. And the idea was that it was supposed to help companies get these suits thrown out earlier. So it was supposed to deter frivolous lawsuits. And from reading like the legal literature, there was kind of three hypotheses I had. One, cases became more efficient after Halliburton, so it did what it was supposed to do. The second hypothesis was that cases became less efficient, meaning it became more attractive if you're a lawyer to try to sue a company for securities fraud. And the idea behind this is that if you're introducing this extra stage in the litigation process where the defendant has the chance to bring in an expert, that means litigation cost is higher for the defendant. So defendants might just want to get their cases dismissed easier. That means if you're a lawyer, securities fraud cases are more attractive. And then the third hypothesis was there's no impact. Judges maybe can't really evaluate quantitative event studies, or they can't confidently evaluate quantitative economic data. Maybe Supreme Court precedents aren't that effective in general. So I kind of wanted to study these three things. So my data set is a partial copy of the Securities Class Action Clearinghouse. It's pretty common in the literature. I had data set on all the 2,200 federal securities fraud class actions between 2008 and 2020. And my methodology was a differences and differences estimation, and I was trying to isolate the causal treatment effect of the Supreme Court precedent. So in my data, cases were either labeled as treated by Halliburton, meaning the precedent applied to them, or not treated by Halliburton. And a key point in my kind of study is that I have this control group called Section 11 cases. So Section 11 cases are securities fraud cases brought on an IPO. So I'll kind of ignore the legal jargon, but basically those cases should not be treated by Halliburton 2. Halliburton 2 shouldn't apply to them. So I have a control group and then a treatment group. So I already mentioned this, but kind of the main problems with my data was, when is a case treated by Halliburton 2? The decision comes down in June 2014, and you have to decide, okay, if a case is ongoing in June 2014, is it treated by the precedent? If it's filed T+1 days, is it treated? How long does it take for a Supreme Court precedent to come down, judges to internalize the precedent, and then apply it to a case? So there was that problem. Also, 2008 and 2009 seemed to be extreme outliers. There was a lot of securities fraud cases those days. And also, the control group was kind of noisy. There wasn't a lot of observations for an IPO securities fraud claim, so that was kind of my problem, and I'll show that more. Cool. So there were 4 litigation outcomes that I was kind of interested in. The first was dismissal rates. So what I wanted to see was that Halliburton 2 made cases easier to defend. So I would want to see case dismissal rates being up. So I used a lot of different specifications. You see within 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, and 4 year. So the orange lines are Section 11 claims. That's my control group. And the blue lines are Section 10b claims. Those are normal securities fraud cases. So I just classed the data by year. So what I eventually found is, no matter what specification I did, the treatment effect of Halliburton 2 was inconclusive, meaning in some specifications I got that there was a large statistically significant impact increasing dismissal rates, and some I had a large statistically significant impact decreasing dismissal rates. And I kind of had to say this was inconclusive. And what was problematic about the data set is that it's not black and white if a case is settled or dismissed. So for example, you might settle out of court, but the judge dismisses the case just to get it out of the docket. So it's not sure if that case is actually dismissed or settled. So I wasn't able to make a conclusion on dismissal rate. So the next thing I looked at was case length. So what I wanted to see, or what I was interested in, is if case length went up after Halliburton 2. This would kind of go to the idea that Halliburton 2 made litigation more complex, longer, and harder to defend. So one, you didn't see that. So if you look, the blue lines, again, are my Section 10b, so those are the treatment group. You actually see them trending down after Halliburton 2. And then I'll also say, after doing the actual analysis, I didn't find any statistically significant results on this. Now, what I did find interesting that there was a statistically significant increase in cases in terms if you collapse the data by annual filings. So what I found was that the treatment effect of Halliburton 2 was an increase of 52.7 cases per year in terms of just how many cases were filed. And that's pretty significant given this, and that was significant at the 1% level. And that's pretty significant if you think about there's only like maybe 100 to 200 securities fraud cases filed a year. So this is really strong evidence that, if anything, Halliburton 2 made securities fraud lawsuits more attractive to lawyers, that they were more excited to sue for securities fraud after Halliburton 2. So that would kind of lend to this idea that, if anything, Halliburton 2 did the opposite of what it was expected and made it more attractive to sue, probably by making it more expensive for defendants to defend their case. And the final litigation outcome I looked at was filings in the Southern District of New York. Just for some context, Southern District of New York is where most financial crime, most financial misconduct cases are litigated. It's well known that judges in that district are more savvy financially. So what I was interested in studying was there an exit from filing in the Southern District of New York, meaning lawyers would selectively file in other court districts because they want to avoid these judges. So you kind of see that in the data. So if you look at the blue line before and after Halliburton 2, you see that the portion of cases filed in the Southern District of New York actually goes down. What was problematic is that I didn't have a lot of observations in my control group. So you see there's a lot of noise in the orange observations, and there was no statistically significant. Cool. So like I said before, dismissal rates was inconclusive, no impact on case length. We saw a material increase in the volume of annual filings, so that would mean Halliburton 2 did the opposite of what it wanted to, and we couldn't get any impact on the filings in the Southern District of New York. So what's the policy implication? One, the cool thing about this study is that it used a diff and diff technique. If you survey most of the legal literature, when they study court precedents, they don't really go that deeper besides looking at like summary statistics. So it's cool, an example of something a little bit more econometric, more quantitative to study the effect of a court precedent. The second point I want to mention is that Halliburton 2 was not a paradigm shift or particularly meaningful. If anything, it did the opposite of what it was supposed to do. So this is kind of consistent with what the legal literature said at the outset of when the case was handed down. And if anything, what my JP kind of says is that if you really want to reform securities fraud litigation, maybe not the best way to do it is these kind of mini Supreme Court precedents. A more effective way to do it is kind of an ambitious act by Congress, something in the spirit of the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act Committee. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Caren. I was advised by Professor Ashenfelter. The title of my JP was General Employment Effects of Ban the Box and Certificate of Restoration Policies, which I'll go into detail a little later. So the motivation of my paper was, the inspiration was from a class I took last fall, Politics of Crime and Punishment, and we focused on the proliferation of the incarcerated population in the late 1900s, early 2000s. This resulted in a large-scale economic loss of opportunities for the incarcerated population and those who left incarceration, defined as ex-offenders, people who leave after incarceration face many barriers to employment, including weak labor market characteristics. So this includes low education, maybe previous or little to no previous employment. There's demonstrated employer discrimination through mass pair studies, where all other observable characteristics held equal. Employers are more likely to discriminate against those with a felony history. Additionally, there are certain job eligibility restrictions. So some jobs with licenses are restricted from ex-offenders from being employed in those industries. However, research has also demonstrated that ex-offenders who are able to find employment after release are much less likely to recidivate or to commit crime again. So this provides both economic and societal benefit for both the individual and communities around. So my paper focused on two policy responses. So the first is ban the box, one that you might have heard before. This prevents employers from asking in the application round whether someone has a criminal record. This is in effect in 36 states and DC in the public sector and 14 states in the private sector. And that totals to about 75% of the population in the US, which is under jurisdiction of a ban the box policy. Research has documented, however, that there are unintended consequences due to increased statistical discrimination. Because of information restrictions, a lot of employers may use skill, race, and age as a proxy for criminal history. The second policy, which is lesser known, is certificates of restoration. So this is a court-certified recognition of employabilities by ex-offenders. So ex-offenders can apply and get a certificate demonstrating that they are employable. This is in effect only in 16 states and DC, but the programs vary widely. And in terms of both development and how they're administered. Early experimental findings do find that these programs are effective in decreasing barriers to employment. So my research question focused on what effects do these aforementioned policies, which are targeted at ex-offenders, have on the employment of the general population, focusing specifically on low-skilled, young, Black, Hispanic, and white individuals. A main question was, does new ban the box data change existing findings? So part of my paper was to update existing data. And lastly, do these policies interact with each other? And if so, how? So my data primarily came from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Current Population Survey. It's a great data set, very easy to filter what kind of variables you want to look at. And it covered from 2008 to 2020. I examined all states for the ban the box policies and specifically focused on Ohio for the certificate policy due to previous literature that had also demonstrated that the program works well there. My empirical strategy was a series of event study regressions as well as a difference in difference analysis. And on the right-hand side here is an example of the parallel trends assumption with Ohio as the control state, Ohio as the treated state and Michigan as my control. So for the first part, the ban the box update, I looked at 3 different populations, so non-Hispanic Black, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic White. I found no statistically significant effect on employment across these 3 populations. However, if you look at the top left graph here, there seems to be a noisy but downward sloping trend, indicating that employability possibly went down after ban the box policy went in place. These results reinforce evidence of non-positive effects of ban the box policies on employment outcomes for Black individuals, consistent with the previous paper by Doliak. Next, I focused on the certificate policy. The blue box here is the line of interest. Additionally, here I found insignificant effects of the certificate policy, or the Securities, what it's called in Ohio, on employment for both young, low-skilled white and Black individuals. These results are in line with expectations since due to there's no restriction of information. Actually, the employers are being given more information, so you wouldn't expect statistical discrimination. The last part of my paper focused on interactions between the 2 policies, and this kind of came up while I was doing my work when I realized that Ohio had passed a public ban the box policy about 4 years after they had already implemented the certificate policy. And so I wanted to examine perhaps, like, given the existing policy, would ban the box have possible counteracting effects? So I did this by looking at the employment probability for young, low-skilled Black individuals in Ohio and comparing that to the average in Ohio as well as the same population in the US overall. So while I found that there is no statistically different difference between Blacks and average in Ohio, they do not appear to be negatively affected by ban-the-box policies, though it's different from the downward sloping trend we saw 2 slides earlier. In some periods, so the graph on the right, there is a statistically significant difference between young, low-skilled Blacks in Ohio and the same population across the U.S., indicating that there is a diverging trend. So this analysis suggests that the certificate policy in place prior to ban the box possibly has counteracting effects, and in my paper I proposed 2 mechanisms through which that could be true. The first is direct impact through increased employment of ex-offenders. The second is destigmatization of ex-offender employment and spillover effects, which may lead to lower statistical discrimination once the ban-the-box policy is in place. So the implications of my junior independent work, 3 points really. First, it reinforced previous literature that there are at most negligible effects of ban-the-box laws on average employment for low-skilled young Black males. Second, it added to growing literature on certificate policies, so the research in this area is very nascent. And lastly, it suggested a potential relationship between these 2 different policies. And while my research was very preliminary, it opens up an opportunity for additional research in that area. Thank you.
That's good. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Sophia Lewandrowski. I'm a rising senior in the economics department, hopefully from here. And I'm particularly passionate about healthcare economics, and for that reason, for my junior paper, I decided to look at American medical malpractice tort law, and specifically the effect of variations in caps on attorney contingency fees on state health expenditures as a proxy for the practice of defense medicine. I'd like to take a quick second to say thank you to my advisor, Professor Silver, and my AIs, Lucas and Jonathan, who were with me every single step of the way. So just to start off with a quick introduction of the topic, the medical malpractice system in the United States is particularly inefficient, as I'm sure many of you in this room are aware. Costs range from $55 billion to $200 billion per annum. That's 2 to 10% of all U.S. healthcare spending per year. The reason why this happens is because physicians are incentivized to practice defensive medicine out of fear for litigation, and this in turn leads to increased health expenditures, say from increased prescriptions, increased visits, etc. But specifically in the 1970s, there was a jump in medical malpractice claims, and this actually led to state-specific tort reforms that were targeted towards medical malpractice. So when I was looking at this, I saw that extensive but non-conclusive research had actually been done on a few of these named tort reforms. But we had actually a more recent study in 2017 from U, Greenberg, and Haviland that showed that 2 reforms, caps on attorney contingency fees and comparative fault reform, actually affected health expenditures. So a quick definition on caps on attorney contingency fees, because that's what we're zooming in on here today. That's essentially when an attorney has a limit to how much they can be compensated for when a defendant receives some sort of award during litigation. Everyone got that? Cool. Okay, that's most of the paper. So U, Greenberg, and Haviland actually suggested that caps on attorney contingency fees could have a negative effect on health expenditures, so decreasing the practice of defensive medicine. But what I realized is that they actually didn't specify by type of implementation. So whether it was a hard cap or a piecewise function, et cetera. So this actually led me to my research question. So beyond redetermining the negative effect of attorney contingency fee caps on health expenditure, how would different types of implementations on caps on this type of contingency fee affect statewide health expenditures as a proxy for the practice of defensive medicine? And in addition, could we create a nuanced relationship for how these would change by type of provider? So this leads me into my data and my methodology. So to get each instance of reforms in each state, I collected it from the Abraham database of state tort law reforms. which basically collects every single tort law that's been in existence since the 1980s. Use it if you need it, it's amazing. And essentially, I was able to categorize caps on attorney contingencies into 3 categories. These were mutually exclusive and completely exhaustive, which was very good for me. So the first was hard caps. So that's when you have a strict limit on how much an attorney can be compensated from any defendant. And then we have percent-wise caps, where there was a percent of the total award of the defendant that could go to the attorney. And then third, we had jury caps. That's when, during the litigation, a jury decides how much the attorney who's representing the defendant can be compensated. And then in terms of my outcome variable or my expenditure variable, I pulled from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services health expenditures by state, and that also broke down by provider from the 1980s onward. So the thought process here was also to create a difference in differences analysis, taking advantage of the natural experiment that occurred by states implementing, repealing, or actually never implementing any tort law reform related to medical malpractice. And in the equation here, you can see that there's an indicator variable representing if any of the 3 categorized types of caps were present in a certain state or in a certain year or any point. I also accounted for year and state fixed effects, and of course, a vector of controls like income, race, religion, to really try and isolate what the impact of the specific tort laws were. So getting into the results. So I first attempted to conclude what you, Greenberg, and Haviland did, that there was a negative effect of any implementation of a cap on health expenditure. So while I wasn't able to get statistically significant results here, there was a negative effect, which was promising. But this gets a lot more interesting when we look at the different types of implementation specifically. So here we have hard cap percentage jury, like I mentioned earlier. We can see that hard caps were the only negative and statistically significant result of the 3 types of implementations. And hard caps, actually, my hypothesis was that they would provide the biggest decrease in terms of health expenditure, and then percentage and jury following with lesser magnitudes. The reason behind that being was that incentives would have to do with attorneys choosing cases beforehand based on merit. Say, for example, if you have a hard cap, you already know as an attorney how much you're going to be able to be paid, so you're choosing each case based on its individual merit. And then when you go to percentage and jury, those incentives change because you can still get a percentage of a larger payout. And a jury, that doesn't really have to do with the decision choice set of choosing a defendant that happens later on in the process. But we can actually see here that while hard caps did have the least amount of magnitude, although a negative effect on health expenditure, it was the only statistically significant result. This gets a lot more interesting, though, when we look at varied providers. I know there's a lot of numbers up here, so I'll go through them. So we can actually see that there's some statistically significant positive and negative results in terms of impact on health expenditure. So if we're looking at hospital care and physician clinical services, we're seeing a positive relationship with health expenditure, which was not what I expected. In terms of my hypothesis, I thought that there would be a negative relationship with providers that had a lot of face-to-face interaction with patients. But we see that the ones that do have high face-to-face interactions with patients like hospital care and physician clinical services, we're seeing a positive impact on expenditure. So this actually led me to conclude that the economic intuition is a little bit more nuanced. So physicians are actually more likely to engage possibly in a follow-up visit than immediate procedures when not practicing defensive medicine as a result of this specific implementation. So this would decrease the cost of downstream providers like prescription drugs or medical products, anything that has to do with procedure incidents. So if I flip the page here to number 9, probably easier to read, prescription drugs, we're looking at negative effects, non-durable medical products. Those are the things that actually have to do, again, with procedure incidents. So we're seeing decreased expenditures there because there's not an immediate need to call for those types of actions, instead of follow-up. So this leads me into my conclusion. Hard cap implementation can interestingly lead to low magnitude state-level health expenditure decreases, and more specifically in providers with direct exposure to procedure incidents. This has interesting and significant policy implications. So caps on attorney contingency fees are only implemented in 19 states, and 2 of those 19 have actually implemented a hard cap. So states or even federal bodies who want to reduce procedure expenditure specifically can engage in this type of reform. It's really important to state, however, that tort reforms don't necessarily need to lead to highly correlated and causal reductions in the practice of defensive medicine. because we are using health expenditure as a proxy to understand what that might function like. And also more generally, we need more variation in tort law reforms to kind of understand what the implications are over space and time, and especially in order to cleanly identify effects for defense benefits specifically. But nonetheless, certainly some interesting results and a very fulfilling JP for me. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Emiri. I hope you're all doing okay in your seats. I remember this was like online for us, so I could be like eating and doing whatever I want on my side, but you guys are sitting here, thank you. So I did my JP on the Power Initiative grant in the Appalachian region and the instrument track. I'd like to thank my professor, Ashenfelter, and my AI team. And just for a little bit of context into this particular policy, so in the 80s, there was a big coal bust in the Appalachian regions like West Virginia, parts of Pennsylvania, Alabama, as people moved away from producing power from coal. And there's been high economic distress in this area. So I looked at this particular initiative that started during the Obama administration that's been funding local initiatives to create jobs and to train people for jobs. So, for example, things like job training programs at local colleges or little funds to small businesses, that sort. And it's funded over $200 million since it started in 2016 to lots of little projects, so over 300 or around 300 projects. So my question was, have these grants actually led to lower unemployment rates in this region? And I guess a little bit of background into how I came across this issue was I wanted to do something related to energy, climate, and jobs. At the time, President Biden wasn't president at the time. We didn't have this whole talk around power and also job creation. So this is something on my mind. It's been really cool to see it kind of be implemented, the policies that we're seeing here. And that's how I came across it. And through a little bit of literature review, I realized that this particular intervention hadn't been studied before that closely, at least not in a quantitative sense. So it seems like a good opportunity to see. And for my data, my outcome variable, I used unemployment statistics at the county level. So this was very granular data. I needed county level statistics because these grants were given to very local communities. And then for my main independent variable, I called up the Appalachian Regional Commission. So this is the agency that handled this particular policy to get information on their grants. And they were very kind, gave me this information. However, initially I wanted to choose my control group by looking at close seconds to people who got this policy. So people apply to these grants, and some counties get the grant, some counties don't get the grant. And I wanted to compare across counties that applied and almost got it but didn't. Unfortunately, this data wasn't available, so I had to do something called propensity score matching, which I'll go into. And in terms of the model I used an event study to look for trends and then a difference analysis. Now this looks a little scary, but I promise not too bad. I'll explain later. But this is the propensity score matching that I was talking about earlier. So amongst all of the counties in this region, I wanted to compare across similar ones just so I can really isolate the effects of the policies. And so for my first data set, I took all of 334 counties that received the grant and matched it to counties that had a similar probability of getting the grant given all of their socioeconomic characteristics. And then I made another data set that looked at a subset of the counties that received the grant that were even more similar. So it was kind of a more limited data. And this is a very simple plot of the unemployment rates across these two groups. So to your left is the bigger data set, the many-to-one matching data set, and to your right should be the one-to-one more limited data set. And as you can see in both of the graphics here, the unemployments were already declining even before the policy was implemented. And it was really important for me to look if it was going down at the same rate. It looked a bit iffy in the bigger many-to-one data set, but it looked pretty parallel to me in the one-to-one. So what I did was I did an event study, which is a more formal way of looking at parallel trends. And as I guessed for the many-to-one, it looked like we couldn't really assume a parallel trends in the pre-treatment period. All of the red dots could have lined up at the 0 in the pre-treatment period if that was the case. But it looked pretty good for the event study on the right side, the one-to-one matching. In addition to that, it seems like after the policy was implemented, the unemployment rates diverged a little bit afterwards. So it seems like there was some effect, although not in a particular direction. And this is the difference in difference analysis. So to the top is the bigger many-to-one data set. And although I got statistically significant effects on policy variables, we couldn't really interpret this in any meaningful way because we knew, as previously stated, that we couldn't assume parallel trends. And unfortunately, in the other one-to-one data set, there was no statistically significant effect. And that explains what we saw earlier, how there was some divergence, but it wasn't in like one particular direction. Yeah, so conclusions, it looked like unemployment rates were on a downward trajectory, so that's good news for the region, but we couldn't really isolate the impact of this particular policy. However, I was able to identify that the policy might have been really good at targeting some counties that were already on a slower improvement trajectory, so they were targeting counties that needed this grant most. And there was some potential impact that we could see in the data. And as for some limitations, talking to the people at the agency, it seemed like it was a bit too early to do the study. Some of the grants were rolled out like a year or two ago, and for that to translate to unemployment rates, it could take 5 to 10 years, so it was a bit too early perhaps. And the fifth point here, I think, was also another thing that I thought about a lot is like perhaps these grants were doing really good things for the people that received them, but it didn't translate to unemployment rate per se. Like maybe it diminished poverty rates or it had an impact on job retention rates, but not unemployment rates. So those are some of the limitations. I actually have a slide here on advice that I have for all of you juniors here, and mostly this is like reminders for myself as I do my thesis. So first of all, I realized, I've heard this going in, but I realized doing it that like data availability is really the biggest limiting factor to using your topic. So try to get your hands on the data very early. And second, if you're anything like me who likes to think about things through like a public policy perspective, I think an impact evaluation of a particular policy is a pretty good place to start. The methodology is relatively straightforward, but you can be very creative with it and learn a lot along the way. Third, don't be afraid of using very simple techniques and models. Like I know difference in difference is something you learn in your first econometrics class, but as I implemented it, I realized it's actually not that easy to like think of the right specification and to get my data in line to use it. So don't be afraid to use very simple models. And also, I got a lot of work done over my winter break, so utilize your big breaks. Personally, it's really important. It was important for me that I got my data like in shape during those breaks, so that over the semester I can actually do work and not have so much data. And lastly, ask for help from your advisor, your AI, your data librarian. You don't really know who you're going to click with or like who's going to be most helpful to you, so just reach out to a lot of people and from there. But that is from my JW. Thank you.
So your event was not last year, it was years ago, but you still have data labs who expect the facts to themselves. So just don't think about COVID as like the first topic you want to. All right, so I will open it up.
Well, people are thinking about questions. I guess I've got one question just to start off. So I just wanted to begin by just saying how inspiring it was to see all the presentations today. Really terrific example of the kind of breadth of topic in the address of economics, and also the range of methods and analysis. Liliana, there's no one model for a thesis. So just incredibly inspiring to see work. I hope all of the juniors this coming year have been inspired by seeing the previous. So maybe I'll just start with one question for Emiri at the end. Really interesting paper and presentation. I wondered whether you thought about looking at other outcomes besides employment, in particular labor force participation. Some of the recent work on the China shock here in the US by George Gordon Hanson and co-authors sort of actually found very big effects on labor participation. Might not show up in unemployment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would have loved to look at other indicators, but I think the challenge with looking at this particular policy was that it was the grants are very small in size, like the individual ones, and they were targeted at very small projects. And so I had to look at county level data, which for me, it was only available in the form of unemployment rates. And even that, to be very honest, was not the most reliable data at this increment and this granularity. So that was something I realized as I was going through. Like if I wanted to do something very local, you need very granular data. And so I was also thinking along the lines of like when you start these policies, it's a good idea to collect the data along the way if you actually want to evaluate it. And so yeah, as I go into my thesis, I'm thinking a lot about how granular does my data have to be and is it available? Yeah, but thank you for the question.
Any other questions?
Was there, given the evidence on like not work, I mean maybe they haven't read your JP, Congress hasn't read it yet, but or authorities, but has there been discussion? I mean, as anecdotes kind of get, this didn't work out the way we thought, and is there talk of like undoing what?
So it is like well known that securities fraud is still like not like a great system right now. It was actually a Supreme Court case in 2021 about a different precedent. So it's still like being like revamped and how the litigation procedure is. The appetite to reform it is not there right now. And one of the reasons is that people actually like the fact that you can sue very easily for securities fraud. And there's actually like there's a small subliterature of people who want to see securities fraud being kind of like the mechanism to get companies to be compliant. So with like social justice initiatives. So, for example, a lot of securities fraud cases in the last year are things about, for example, companies not fulfilling their climate change objectives, or BlackRock, for example, got sued last year because they weren't following through on their initiatives to have a more diverse board. So some people actually want to keep the system as it is so that they can use securities fraud as a proxy to advance other issues. So there's still like an appetite to reform it, but other people want to keep the system it is for like this secondary purpose.
So for those of you who didn't mention sort of how the idea, like the light bulb moment, how did that come? Why don't I just take a few sentences to describe like process of finding.
Yeah, so for me, I think one thing that was really interesting is like whenever I'd go back to Pakistan, I'd see a lot of people, a lot of like family friends starting to sell things over WhatsApp specifically. So one of my aunts loves baking and specifically would make a lot of macaroons, and was telling me that she started to sell a lot over WhatsApp, and obviously during COVID that stopped, but that was a really interesting, like thought-provoking thing. And I don't know, at some point I guess that just came back to me as I was like thinking of topics, and I decided to dig deeper.
Yeah, so what's funny about my topic is a lot of it came from kind of this presentation last year. So somebody did a really interesting paper on Uber's effect on labor markets. And I had previous experience studying the gig economy and knew it was something I was interested in. But it's an extremely challenging topic to understand because of the gig nature of work. But he was able to kind of creatively attack this problem. So I worked with him pretty closely to understand how I can look at this. And after reading about the wage gaps that were created in Uber in a podcast, I think it was Freakonomics, I wanted to kind of connect those two things and look at gaps for different groups and understand what the intersection between these wage effects were and the observed wage gaps that this group in Stanford found, I think, a couple years ago.
So I absolutely knew I wanted to do something with medical malpractice, but knew nothing about the academic literature. So I kind of just went on the Princeton library site and literally typed in medical malpractice and read every single paper that like came up on the results. The question that I constantly asked myself is, what are they missing? How can I make this better? Where is the hole? And that's where you will find your topic, because I mean, a great way to do the JP is just to add on to another paper and answer an additional question that they forgot.
Yeah, I guess adding on to what I said earlier, like I was already interested in the cross section between like energy and labor, but I think what I did was like Googled. There's like the news tab in Google. I like put in keywords, and one of them was power, and this initiative just happened to be called the Power Initiative. So I was like, okay, I found my policy. I think that's how I came across mine.
I mentioned earlier that I was inspired from one of my classes, but I knew the area that I wanted to work in, and my advisor kind of just like went around everyone in our group and just like, what is the topic you want to work with? And just gave like 2 to 3 different ideas. So kind of seems hard to generate topic ideas sometimes, especially now that we're doing our senior thesis. But advisors are super helpful in that respect.
Everybody's back. I really like how Emiri draws this again, what we should do now when you started out on this project. So that was super helpful. Okay, so just to thank everybody again for your terrific presentations. It's really, really impressive, not just the content of the research. Great job you did actually presenting the papers and communicating clearly the question, the method. I think that was also a great example here today. And before we close, I just wanted to mention that we've got some really interesting upcoming events that you may be interested in, could provide some ideas for future junior papers. So we've got a great talk with Joel Slamrod coming up. We've got a fantastic new book about taxation, which is very provocative, very amusing, lots of funny stories there that actually shed a light on a lot of applications. We've also got a more historical book by Jonathan Levy about the history of American capitalism. Thank you very much to everybody. Let's give everyone a round of applause.